So let's talk about special Pokemon events. Mainly, we're talking about mostly legendary Pokemon. You know those special Pokemon that you can usually only get over Wi-Fi or whatever? Yeah, it wasn't that easy when I was a kid. The first time I really experienced these was with Pokemon Emerald version. And for those who have been following the channel, you may be saying, wait, James, didn't you not actually own a handheld Pokemon game until Diamond version? Yes. But I think I've also mentioned before that I enjoyed Diamond version so much after my only real previous experiences with the series up to that point being borrowing my cousin's Silver version as a little kid and later getting Colosseum on the GameCube, that I actually saved up allowance money for what seemed like months to get Emerald version, which at that point was knocked down in price at my local Walmart. And it was great. But what was also interesting is before I even really got into Pokemon, I lived in Houston, Texas. And I remember that because I missed out on one of the coolest Pokemon events of all time. And that was for the legendary Pokemon Deoxys, the space virus Pokemon. And they were giving it away at no other than Space Center Houston, which is, it's a big NASA complex / museum. It's incredible. I really highly recommend anyone gets a chance to go there. And I had a buddy of mine who was lucky enough to have a copy of Pokemon Emerald version when they were giving away Deoxys at Space Center, and it's been nearly a decade and a half later, and I am still jealous. I guess what I'm getting at today I want to go over a little brief history of special event Pokemon, and also my own kind of personal experiences with that. So that's what we're going to be doing today on Master Trainer, the channel aimed at helping you become a Pokemon Master. So to start off, let's go back to the Game Boy. This is a Game Boy Color. I have an original Game Boy in storage, but the very first event Pokemon was actually Mew. And it's funny because the reason Mew is an event is it originally just was not planned. It was supposed to be like this mythical, fabled Pokemon, but then we would have Mewtwo, who is the big boss based off the myth, the legend. But then at the last moment, Mew was slipped in when they realized that they're like, oh snap, people can't actually complete the Pokedex. So what they did was to create events and create what was called the Mew Machine, which was essentially a giant Game Boy that you'd plug your own Game Boy into and then just trade a Mew into your game. This was later done with Celebi for Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal versions, though if I remember correctly, in Japan for Pokemon Crystal version, they actually had the first ever event Pokemon that you didn't have to leave your house to get. And that's because in Japan with Pokemon Crystal version, you could actually connect your Game Boy using an adapter up to a mobile phone and then actually battle, trade, and get events like this over that connection. It didn't last for too long, but it's kind of weird to think that the features that essentially defined the global trade station from Diamond and Pearl onwards, which released in 2006, were actually present in Pokemon Crystal version, which we didn't get until 2001. So then we get to Generation 3, Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, which I think was really kind of the king of event Pokemon. There were so many events. I think part of it came from the fact that you couldn't actually trade up from Gold, Silver, and Crystal to Ruby and Sapphire. I call that the Great Divide in the Pokemon series. But yeah, there were so many special events for the Generation 3 games. Let's see, there was Mew, there was Jirachi, there was Deoxys, which I've mentioned already, Latias or Latios, whichever one you didn't get, you could get. I know there are countless others, Ho-Oh and Lugia, just a crazy amount of event Pokemon. But what really defined this generation for me as well was a special event Pokemon you can get through other games. The first of these was actually a Pokemon Channel, which depending on the region would actually give you a Jirachi or Celebi if you beat it. So if you pre-ordered Pokemon Colosseum from GameStop, which I didn't even know this existed until years later, but and this isn't even my original Pokemon Colosseum disc, but I got this at a later date. But you could get this, the Pokemon Colosseum bonus disc. It came for a preview of the game itself, which is weird since, to get this special GameCube bonus disc for Pokemon Colosseum, you had to pre-order Pokemon Colosseum. Along with a trailer for the movie, Jirachi Wishmaker, which was actually the only of the advanced movies I had on DVD as a kid. But to go with that, you could also get a Jirachi, which means that if you had one of these as a back in the day, you could pretty much just generate all the Jirachis you want for your friends, which is great. And then there are also some special Pokemon, like a special Zigzagoon and whatnot, that you get through Pokemon Box Ruby and Sapphire. So, you know, this is really a game I need to talk about in depth at some point because it's such an incredibly rare game. You could only get it at the Pokemon Center store in the US, which means for you in Canada, go to the States or don't get the game. But it's really cool. It came with, in Japan at least, the special Ruby and Sapphire memory card. It has all these posters and stuff. A Jirachi Wishmaker poster, but this too had some of its own exclusive Pokemon. And then it kind of exploded again when we got into the DS games. Like, between all the DS Pokemon, like, let's go over Generation 4's events. We had Arceus, we had Darkrai, we had Shaymin, we had Legendary Beasts, we had the Reggie Trio, we had the event Regigigas, not to be confused with the regular Regigigas. We had the Celebi event for Heart Gold and Soul Silver, where you found out that Silver, your rival, was Team Rocket Giovanni's son, an event that I really think should have been an end-game event and not a special event. That Arceus event, which also got you a level 1 Dialga, Palkia, or Giratina, your pick. And of course, a notch-eared and Pikachu-colored Pichus. Some really incredible events here, and there are so many of them, and they were really noticeable in Diamond and Pearl as well because they unlocked areas that you just couldn't get to. I mean, this was a thing in Ruby and Sapphire as well, but they really altered the map here. You had the longest route in history just to get Shaymin, and to get Darkrai, you had to go through this really creepy event which took you to, what was it? Full Moon Island? New Moon Island? One of those. And then, of course, there's the most infamous event, which is the coolest event in the entire series, and it was never officially released because Game Freak thought it'd be too confusing for kids, which was the Azure Flute event. So essentially, the actual Arceus event would just give you one, you know, you just be given one. It's not that special. But how this unused event, which I swear, if you have this is reason enough to get an Action Replay DS, just so you can hack it into the game. Essentially, you get given this item by a man at a Pokemart, and then, you know, you get clues about Arceus, you know, because you find all the plates. They go even deeper into it in Platinum, I think. And you go to the top of Mount Coronet, where, of course, you got Dialga and Palkia, or in Platinum version, the portal to the Distortion World originally. And you have a choice to blow it, you know, blow into the flute. And it makes a literal stairway to heaven, because Arceus is essentially the god Pokemon. So you then climb up above Mount Coronet, essentially in the Hall of Origin, which is essentially Pokemon Heaven, where you fight Arceus, which is essentially God. That's incredible. There's a thing you stand on Mount Coronet that has a picture of a flute on it. It's right at Spirit Pillar, you can't miss it. And it literally prompts you as soon as you stand on it, as long as you have the Azure Flute in your bag. It's, never mind. Going on into Black and White, we got kind of the last actual event Pokemon. There's really kind of a shift towards Wi-Fi events here. Like, I think like Keldeo and Meletta, depending on where you're on, were either Wi-Fi events or in person, though don't quote me on that. The one I know that was really neat was the Victini event, which unlocked Liberty Island. And that's kind of the last big major event I remember. And I don't even remember how I got that. I think I was at an American GameStop or something. But yeah, there aren't really events like that anymore. I think the closest thing is starting with X and Y. You can go into like an EB Games up here and get a serial code which you could put into a thing, which is cool. They did a lot with Sun, Moon, and Black and White. But it's not really the same. On one hand, there's the social thing of going with your friends, you know, and finding like the certain GameStops during the certain like often only 1 week periods, or in the Space Center example, 2-day period in which you get these rare Pokemon. But also what I really like about these events either being distributed over serial code, QR code, or just over the internet is that it really makes them much more accessible, which I think that's good. You know, Pokemon is a series that should be accessible, and I'm glad that as legendary Pokemon, I guess I could go and do a video on this at some point. They don't seem nearly as special anymore because there's so many of them. I don't know, I'm rambling on. Oh, actually, I guess there was technically one. If you bought the Pokeball Plus for Pokemon Let's Go that came with a Mew inside it, and that's the only official way to get Mew, I guess. Unless you count Meltan, but that's Pokemon Go, and that's not really an event. But now I'm just rambling, as I said. So, what's your favorite special event Pokemon? Did you enjoy this kind of ramble and look back at Pokemon events? Let me know down in the comment section below. And while you're at it, subscribe to Master Trainer for more great content like this, or even share this video out with the world, because every view counts. So with that, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.